The maps shouldn't exist. That was my first thought when I found them buried in the British Library's cartographic archives. Ordnance survey documents from the 1870s showing an elaborate tunnel network beneath central London. Not sewers, not the underground, something else entirely. Reinforced stone corridors with 12-foot ceilings running under Parliament, under Whitehall, under the Bank of England. Construction photographs showing workers and passages that officially never existed. Engineering records documenting infrastructure the modern city pretends was never built. I started researching Victorian urban planning. I found evidence of systematic historical erasure. The tunnels are real. The silence is intentional. The first documents I found were in the archives of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Meeting minutes from 1867 reference what they called the Westminster Passages. They describe a network of underground corridors connecting government buildings across central London. The minutes discuss ventilation improvements, structural reinforcements, and access point modifications. They record routine maintenance for infrastructure that, according to every modern map and official record, does not exist. The references are casual, matter of fact, as if everyone in the room knew exactly what the Westminster Passages were and saw no need to explain them. I found 17 separate references across 3 decades of meeting minutes. Then the references stop. After 1894, the passages are never mentioned again. The Ordnance Survey maps told the same story. I examined surveys from 1872, 1879, and 1886. Each shows tunnel networks beneath Whitehall, beneath the City of London, and beneath Westminster. They show dotted lines indicating underground passages and annotations marking access points, ventilation shafts, and junction chambers. The 1879 survey alone documents over 4 miles of subterranean corridors in central London that appear on no modern infrastructure plan. I checked Transport for London records, nothing. I checked Thames Water documentation, nothing. I checked the London Underground official historical archives, and the tunnels do not exist, except they do. They are right there on the Victorian maps, drawn with the same precision as every sewer line and water main, which makes their absence from modern plans all the more striking. The photographs were harder to find, but impossible to dismiss. The Metropolitan Board of Works maintained photographic records of major construction projects throughout the 1870s and the 1880s. Most show what you would expect: sewer excavations, embankment construction, bridge foundations. But scattered among them are images of something else. Workers standing in finished stone corridors with vaulted ceilings, tunnels with smooth walls and consistent dimensions stretching beyond the camera's range. These were not construction sites. These were completed passages being documented for official records. The architectural details are precise: reinforced archways, drainage channels cut into stone floors, mounting points along the walls where fixtures once hung, infrastructure built to last centuries, photographed, cataloged, then erased from history. The dimensions kept appearing in the engineering records: 12-foot ceiling heights, corridor widths of 8 to 10 feet, doorway proportions that seemed excessive for simple utility passages. I started comparing these measurements to standard Victorian infrastructure. Sewer tunnels from the same period averaged 6 to 8 feet in height. Utility corridors rarely exceeded 5 feet in width. The passages shown in these photographs and described in these documents were built to a different scale entirely. They were not cramped utility spaces, and they were not narrow service corridors. These were passageways designed for something more than occasional maintenance access. The geographic pattern became undeniable once I mapped it. The documented tunnel routes converged on specific locations: the Bank of England, the Houses of Parliament, Whitehall, Somerset House, the Royal Courts of Justice. Not random distribution, not practical utility routing. These passages connected centers of power, centers of finance, centers of administration. The 1879 Ordnance Survey shows a junction chamber beneath Trafalgar Square where 5 separate tunnel routes met. a junction chamber that officially does not exist beneath a public square that millions of people cross every year. The infrastructure is there. The documentation is there. Only the acknowledgement is missing. I found construction records from the Metropolitan Board of Works dated 1874, a budget allocation for passage maintenance across 7 government properties. The amounts were substantial, thousands of pounds for ventilation, drainage, structural repair. The records do not explain what passages. They do not justify the expense. They simply allocate funds for infrastructure that modern records insist was never built. The same pattern repeats in records from 1878, 1882, and 1889. Routine maintenance budgets for tunnels that do not exist. Why would the Victorians build infrastructure on this scale and then pretend they had not? Why would engineering societies discuss passages for 30 years and then never mention them again? Why do maps from one century show tunnel networks that maps from the next century deny? The questions kept multiplying. Every document I found raised 3 more questions I could not answer. And then I noticed something else. The architectural proportions were not just large, they were consistent. The same 12-foot ceiling heights appeared in photographs from Whitehall, from the city, from Westminster, the same doorway dimensions, the same corridor widths, as if the entire network had been built to a single specification, a specification designed for something specific, something that required more space than ordinary humans would need. The passages were not just infrastructure. They were infrastructure built for a purpose we are no longer supposed to ask about. The question that kept me awake was not whether the tunnels existed. The maps proved they existed. The photographs proved they existed. The engineering records proved they existed. The question was what they were for. Utility passages do not need 12-foot ceilings. Maintenance corridors do not require vaulted stone construction. Service tunnels do not connect the Bank of England to Parliament to Whitehall in a network designed for rapid, concealed movement between the most powerful institutions in the British Empire. These were not utility tunnels. They were something else entirely. I started examining the connection points more carefully. The documented routes did not follow logical utility paths. They did not parallel sewer lines or water mains. They connected specific buildings to specific buildings with deliberate precision, government ministries to financial institutions, courts to administrative centers, private estates in Mayfair to government complexes in Westminster. The pattern suggested coordination, communication, movement between centers of power that needed to happen unseen. The architectural proportions kept nagging at me. 12-foot ceilings, 8-foot doorways, corridor widths that could accommodate the passage of large equipment or large groups moving quickly. I thought about the oversized doorways I had seen in government buildings from the same period, the staircases with risers too tall for comfortable climbing, the furniture in estate sales that seemed scaled for someone larger than average. What if the tunnels were not built for the Victorians at all? What if the Victorians inherited infrastructure they did not fully understand and adapted it to their own purposes? Inherited would explain the inconsistencies. Why are construction records so sparse for such massive projects? Why do the architectural specifications not match standard Victorian engineering? Why do the passages appear on maps without any documentation of who built them or when? What if London sits atop infrastructure from something older, something the Victorians found, expanded, and eventually decided to forget? The erasure began in the 1890s. I traced the timeline carefully. References to the Westminster passages stop appearing in Engineering Society minutes after 1894. The Ordnance Survey maps from 1900 onward no longer show the tunnel networks. Budget allocations for passage maintenance disappear from Metropolitan Board of Works records. Within a single decade, infrastructure that had been casually referenced for 30 years simply ceased to exist in official documentation. I submitted Freedom of Information requests to the National Archives. I asked for any records relating to subterranean passages beneath Whitehall, constructed between 1850 and 1900. The response came back within weeks. No records were found. I asked for Metropolitan Board of Works documentation on the Westminster passages and for engineering assessments of tunnel infrastructure beneath the Bank of England. The answers were the same. The files were not classified, not restricted, simply no records were found, as if the documents I had already seen in other archives had never existed. The physical evidence tells a different story. Throughout the 20th century, construction projects across central London occasionally breached unexpected underground chambers. News reports from the 1920s mention workers discovering sealed passages during foundation excavations near Trafalgar Square. The passages were documented, photographed, then bricked up and never mentioned in official records. Similar discoveries occurred in the 1950s during post-war reconstruction and again in the 1970s during underground expansion. Each time the same pattern: discovery, documentation, sealing, silence. I found accounts from historians who had asked similar questions. A researcher in the 1960s published a paper on anomalous Victorian infrastructure. The paper was withdrawn within months. A journalist in the 1980s investigated sealed tunnels beneath government buildings. The investigation ended without publication. No explanations, no retractions, just silence. The questions stopped being asked because asking them led nowhere. The newspaper trail follows the same arc. Victorian-era publications referenced the passages openly. The Times mentioned underground routes between government buildings in articles from the 1870s. The Illustrated London News published engravings of tunnel construction. Then the references stop. After 1895, I found no mainstream newspaper mentions of the Westminster passages or any similar infrastructure. Not denial, not debunking, simply no mention at all. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Documents vanish from archives that should contain them. Maps are redrawn to exclude infrastructure that previous maps showed clearly. Historians who investigate find their work quietly discontinued. Freedom of information requests return empty. Physical discoveries are sealed and forgotten. Not one archive, not one institution. A coordinated silence across government, academia, and media that has persisted for over a century. This is not incompetence. Incompetence leaves traces, mistakes, inconsistencies. This is precision. This is policy. Someone decided that these tunnels should be forgotten, and the machinery of forgetting has operated with remarkable efficiency ever since. The evidence persists only in the gaps, in archives that were not supposed to survive, in photographs that were not supposed to be found, in maps that slipped through the editorial process before someone realized they showed too much. The evidence persists despite everything. I have spent months now walking through central London with different eyes, knowing what lies beneath the pavements, the buildings, the public squares. The tunnels are still there. The entrances are still there, bricked up, sealed behind modern construction, hidden in the basements of buildings that have changed hands a dozen times since the Victorian era. But they haven't disappeared. They've only been made invisible. I spoke with a contractor who worked on a renovation project in Whitehall during the 1990s. He described breaking through a basement wall and finding a finished stone corridor stretching into darkness, a vaulted ceiling, smooth walls, air that smelled old but not stagnant, which suggested ventilation systems still functioning somewhere in the network. His team was told to seal it immediately. No documentation, no photographs, new concrete poured within 24 hours. He still remembers the proportions: 12-foot ceilings, doorways you could drive a small vehicle through, infrastructure that should not exist beneath a government building. Similar accounts surface if you know where to look. A maintenance worker in the City of London found sealed doors in a bank basement that appeared on no building plans. An archivist discovered a junction chamber beneath the British Museum that museum officials insisted was impossible. Construction crews across central London have encountered the same thing for over a century: unexpected passages, impossible infrastructure, and immediate orders to seal and forget. I keep returning to the photographs from the Metropolitan Board of Works archives. The workers standing in those tunnels were not posing in front of mysterious ruins, they were documenting routine infrastructure. The photographs were taken because this was normal, expected. The passages were simply part of how London worked. Something changed between then and now. Not the tunnels. The tunnels remain. What changed was our permission to know about them. The maps from the 1870s still exist. The engineering records still exist. The photographs still exist. Every piece of evidence I found remains in archives across London, preserved by institutional inertia and overlooked by the mechanisms of forgetting. The erasure was thorough but not complete. Enough survived to prove the pattern. Enough survived to raise the questions no one seems willing to answer. I think about the scale of what I've documented, miles of underground passages beneath central London, a network connecting government, finance, judiciary, and private estates, infrastructure built to specifications that don't match standard Victorian engineering, and all of it systematically erased from official history within a single decade. This wasn't accidental. This was a decision. Someone looked at this network and decided the public shouldn't know it existed. Why? What purpose did the tunnels serve that required such complete erasure? What moved through those passages that couldn't be acknowledged? Who used infrastructure designed for proportions larger than ordinary human scale? The questions multiply faster than answers appear. Every document I find opens 3 new avenues of investigation that lead to the same destination. Sealed records, missing files, coordinated silence. If this exists beneath London, where else, what other cities sit atop infrastructure we're not supposed to know about? The same pattern of oversized architecture appears across Europe, across former colonies, across every major city that rose to prominence in the 18th and 19th centuries. The same period, the same proportions, the same subsequent erasure. London isn't unique. London is just where I started looking. My relationship with the city has changed permanently. I walk through Trafalgar, knowing that beneath my feet lies a junction chamber where 5 tunnel routes once met. I pass government buildings, knowing their basements contain sealed doors that lead somewhere we're not supposed to ask about. I look at the oversized doorways, the grand staircases, the furniture in museum collections that seem scaled for someone larger, and I no longer accept the explanations I was taught. Decorative excess, ceremonial design, aesthetic choice. None of it explains the evidence. The tunnels remember what the records forgot. The infrastructure persists beneath streets that have been repaved a dozen times, beneath buildings that have been demolished and rebuilt, beneath a city that has convinced itself certain questions aren't worth asking. But the passages remain, the sealed doors remain, the photographs remain. Everything necessary to understand what was erased still exists, waiting for someone willing to look. I don't have all the answers. I may never have all the answers, but I know the questions now. I know what the maps showed before they were redrawn. I know what the photographs documented before they were filed away and forgotten. I know that beneath this city, beneath every city built in that era, there exists infrastructure we inherited without understanding, infrastructure we use without acknowledgement, infrastructure designed for purposes and people we've been taught to forget. The Victorian tunnels they erased from history are still there. The only thing missing is permission to ask why.